Facebook and start the webinar. Welcome everybody back to the MSU Science Festival this afternoon. And today I'm joined by Jason Wholehan from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, who's going to lead us on a parasite safari. So take it away, Jason.
Okay, thank you. So welcome to Parasite Safari. Join me and we'll discover and explore the exotic world of human parasites. I'll be your guide, Jason Wholehan. I'm a public health microbiologist. And before we start the safari, I'll take you to the state laboratory. This is where I and a bunch of other great public health scientists all work. We do a whole bunch of things to try and prevent disease and promote wellness within the state, parasitology being just a small part of that. So normally when you go on a safari, you go look for large wild game. Today, we're going to see small game like worms, tapeworms, blood parasites, and even some insects. So what are parasites? Let's start there. Well, really, parasite is kind of a catch-all term. So we're going to start with what they're not. Parasites are not viruses. Viruses are very small, very simple life forms. Like COVID-19 that we've all become unfortunately so familiar with. Again, usually when we talk about parasites, we're not talking about bacteria. Bacteria are bigger than viruses, but oftentimes much smaller than parasites. They're also far simpler than parasites. So insects, we are going to talk about several insects, but generally, unless it's a very specific case, insects are not considered parasites. So really, what are parasites? Like I said, parasitology is kind of a catch-all term. So we're going to visit a whole bunch of different animals on our safari here. We're going to see some very small, very simple single-celled amoeba. We're going to see some multicellular worms. And like I said, we are going to visit some parasites or some insects because insects are involved in transmitting parasites and some do cause parasitic infections. So where can we find these parasites? Well, parasites are everywhere that we are. They live inside of our bodies. So really, wherever humans are, we can find some human parasites. But generally, when we talk about parasites, a lot of them do like warmer areas of the world. They're often referred to as tropical diseases. So around the equator, maybe there may be more parasites than in the cold north. And generally, parasites like areas that have poor sanitation or generally poor hygiene. It helps to continue their life cycles. So where does that leave us here in Michigan? Well, generally, Michigan, we have a low burden of parasitemia or parasitic infections because it is cold. That generally keeps some of the parasite load down in the environment. And we also generally have clean drinking water and clean food to eat. So that also helps to stop the spread of parasites. So I am a laboratorian, so we are going to focus a little bit more from the laboratory angle of how do laboratories find parasites. Well, the old school method, and really the method that we still rely on a lot, is we just take the sample from the infected person, put it on a glass slide and put that under a microscope and try and find the parasite. Now, there are other techniques to try and diagnose parasitic infections, and one of those is that we can actually look for the DNA in the parasite. We call those molecular or PCR tests. Now, these tests are more complicated and more difficult. They all need to be unique and focused on the parasite that you're trying to look for. So like I said, generally, we do just rely on putting it under a microscope and looking around. Okay, so our first stop on our safari, we're going to dive into the intestines. But before we get there, let me just talk about how a lot of these intestinal parasites are spread. They're spread through what's called the fecal oral route, or literally poop to mouth. And so that's how a lot of these parasites get into your intestines, is, as you can see in this diagram, it's maybe a little busy here, but you have an infected person may poop, and if they don't have some place like a toilet, it can pass easily into the drinking water. And if you don't wash your hands and have good food hygiene, you can then reintroduce that parasite into your mouth, and it can start its life cycle over. Okay, so let's dive into the intestines here. And the first creature that we're going to look at here is a pinworm, or Enterobus vermicularis. So I wanted to start with pinworm here because it does have a relatively simple life cycle. The worms live in your small intestine. The female actually crawls out of your intestine onto your butthole at night and lays its eggs. And here's a picture of the eggs. They kind of look like flattened footballs. And now those eggs, when they're on your butthole skin, it makes it itchy. And especially if you don't wash your hands after you do that, you can reintroduce it either to yourself and reinfect yourself, or spread it to other people. And oftentimes places like daycares or where small children may not have good hand hygiene, pinworm can be a problem. And so here's a short video of some pinworms actually swimming around in someone's colon. This is probably a pretty heavy infection. As you can see, the pinworm is about the size of a grain of rice swimming around in there. And as you can see from this background picture, all those little dots on the background photo here, those are the eggs. So a lot of these parasites are just egg-laying factories. They just produce and produce eggs, eggs, eggs. So the next place we're going to go is what I'm going to call the single-celled parasite pond. And now these are all single-celled parasites. And the first one that we're going to talk about is Giardia. I always like Giardia because I think it's one of the best looking parasites. It kind of looks like a face, and it's not really a face. It doesn't have a face. It's just one cell. But those squiggly lines that kind of come off it that kind of look like hairs, those are what scientists call flagella, and that's what this organism uses to swim around. The next parasite we're going to talk about is Cryptosporidium. It's those little red dots there on the blue background. Cryptosporidium can be a problem because this is actually the smallest parasite we're going to talk about today. It is so small that it's actually difficult to filter out of water systems, and it happens to be somewhat bleach resistant. So a Cryptosporidium is sometimes implicated if a child goes to like a splash pad or a pool that recycles the water. If the bleach is not strong enough and if the filtering system is not good enough, it can just keep recirculating in that splash pad or that pool. And the last single-cell parasite is entamoeba. And this one actually kind of represents a whole group of single-celled parasites. And in the lab, what we do is that little bullseye, the different species of entamoeba all look a little bit different. And that's how we try and differentiate these entamoebas. Okay, the next parasite we're going to talk about are hookworms, or Ancylostoma or Necator. And these are different worms, as you can see from the different mouth parts. That's actually how they hold on to your intestines, are these different mouth parts. But interestingly, all of their eggs look exactly the same. And here is a picture of the egg that we would see in the laboratory passed in the feces. And again, here's another life cycle. So hookworms, you pass a bunch of eggs in your stool or your poop. And if it doesn't go into a kind of a clean toilet, the egg will hatch and a worm will grow in the environment. And if you walk around barefoot, the worm will crawl back into someone's foot, crawl up through your body, actually find your lungs, you cough it up and re-swallow it, and now it's back in your intestine to start the whole life cycle over again. And kind of the interesting thing about hookworm, it's somewhat implicated on why there's such a stereotype of Southerners being stupid and lazy, is that way back before good hygiene practices, hookworm infections were very heavy in the South. And they'd often be so heavy that they would kind of delay cognitive or kind of make people stupid and lazy, because you have all of these worms living in your stomach, sucking off nutrients. So thankfully, now that we have better toilets and shoes, hookworm infections are not such a problem in this country. So here's relative sizes of roundworms that we've talked about. As you can see, we have the pinworm, Enterobus formicularis is the smallest. The next two were the hookworms we talked about. The largest roundworm that causes human infections is Ascaris lumbricoides, and it actually is about the size of an earthworm. It's not an earthworm. And you can tell the difference between an earthworm and an Ascaris. Ascaris, the body is completely smooth, as an earthworm usually kind of has segments, or it's a little bit more chopped up. And Ascaris don't crawl around in nature. They only live inside of people. So the largest parasite that we're going to visit today, this guy can grow to be about 30 feet. And this is the tapeworm, or Tenia species. So tapeworms, again, I have another life cycle photo here. As you can see, the head part, or as we call in the lab, a scolex, that's what kind of holds on to your intestines. And the tapeworm has all these little segments that grow and grow and grow. And it can be, like I said, grow up to 30 feet long. Each one of those segments is essentially an egg-laying factory. Tapeworms can lay millions of eggs a day. And so there's a whole bunch of different tapeworms out there. The one that happens to infect humans, there's two species that happen to infect humans. One likes to go to a cow and one likes to go to a pig. So we have either beef tapeworm or pork tapeworm. And once they get into those animals, they try and find their muscle, and they develop in the muscle, and then hope that the tapeworm hopes that we will then eat the muscle. So this is what the tapeworm does in either the beef or the pork. It'll grow into a little nodule, and then it's hoping that we'll eat it. Unfortunately, sometimes it can get confused and cause that same symptom in people. And this is actually a very dangerous condition of having all these worms actually growing in your muscle. And here's another short video of a tapeworm in someone's colon. And again, this could just be one organism just kind of all wrapped up in there. Okay, so let's escape the intestines here. Let's crawl down the leg and follow the guinea worm. So guinea worm used to be a really big problem in Africa, but through good public health practices and eradication, it's getting much better. So here's this other life cycle. And I guess I'd like to point out that the guinea worm's life cycle is somewhat more complicated. Really, a lot of these parasites blur the line between humans and the environment, that these parasites look at us as just another resource to pass through, another place to live, another niche in the ecosystem. And guinea worm, is a good example of that. So another interesting thing about guinea worm is that humans have accidentally pushed numerous animals to extinction. And guinea worm, we have been purposefully trying to push this animal to extinction for decades. And this animal is very tenacious. And it's just kind of an interesting that we've accidentally caused so many extinctions. And here we're purposefully trying to get rid of this animal, and it's very difficult. Okay, so now let's hop into the bloodstream and find our next parasite. Now we're going to talk about malaria or Plasmodia species. So this life cycle I know is a little complicated. Plasmodia has a very complicated life cycle. I just want to point out a couple of the points that malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes, and only specific mosquitoes, the Anopheles. So if an infected mosquito bites you, it may pass the parasite onto you, and it can either go to your liver or to your bloodstream. And once it's in your bloodstream, it can cause a really bad infection because it gets into your red blood cells and eats up everything inside of it, and then explodes more parasites into your bloodstream to start the life cycle all over again. So what the parasite is hoping to do here is to get back into a mosquito and restart the life cycle all over again. So this is a picture I took in our laboratory of a really heavy Plasmodia infection. All these little red dots, those are the red blood cells. And the purple rings inside of them, those are the Plasmodia parasite. And this is another picture I took. The mosquito here is pointing to the form of the Plasmodia parasite that it wants to get back into the mosquito to start its life cycle over again. So malaria is definitely one of these tropical diseases. It's more common in warm places where mosquitoes like to live. The countries in red, it have heavy malaria transmission. The yellow, a little bit better. So in the United States, we do not have malaria transmission, but we used to. America used to be a malaria zone. And all the counties here highlighted in red, that represents increased malaria deaths. And this is from the US Census data in 1870. And actually, interestingly enough, the CDC was placed in Atlanta and not in Washington, D.C., specifically as a public health measure to fight malaria in the South. And how you fight malaria is through mosquito control, essentially. So we do have a blood parasite that circulates in Michigan, and that's called Babesia. And I guess the interesting thing about Babesia is that it's really a parasite of mice or rodents. And it passes, as you can see here, it passes between mice and a tick. But every once in a while, that tick can get confused and bite a human and introduce the parasite into humans. And again, this can be pretty bad because it lives in our blood cells and breaks the blood cells open. And of course, you're basically causing internal bleeding here. You're running out of blood cells. So again, the red circles here are the red blood cells. The purple circles in them, that is the parasite. And I do want to make a note that ticks, there are a whole bunch of different species of tick, but not all of them transmit Babesia. The tick that lives in Michigan and transmits Babesia is the deer tick, and it happens to be the same one that transmits Lyme disease. Okay, the next stop, we're going to go to the brain. And again, this is another parasite that generally passes between cats and whatever cats eat, being mice or small birds. But every once in a while, that egg can transfer to humans instead. And it can cause really bad infections of pregnant women. It can really hurt the baby. And that's why pregnant women are recommended to not change kitty litter. So the interesting thing here about toxoplasma, and that brings up another point about parasites, is that mice that are infected with the toxoplasma parasite show no fear of cats. They're actually attracted to cats which then lead the cat to eat the mouse and thus continue the life cycle of the Toxoplasma parasite. There is evidence of people who are infected with the Toxoplasma parasite, again, being more attracted to cats and making bad decisions or poor judgments. So parasites, it's kind of an interesting area of study of parasitic mind control. The parasite gets inside of you and really does all it can to continue its life cycle at whatever expense to the host. Okay, so we've crawled all over the body here. We've been in the blood, the intestines. We've even stopped at the brain. So now we're going to stop at the skin and talk about a couple of these parasitic insects. So we have head lice, or Pediculus humanus, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, probably from grade school, that you don't want to share hats or combs. And as you can see here, some of the eggs in someone's hair. So you don't want to share your hat or your comb with someone, or else you might get this little guy crawling around in your hair. Bed bugs, this is who you want to look for if you ever go to a hotel. So bed bugs are about the size of apple seeds. They're brown and flat. They truly look like apple seeds with legs. And like a lot of insects, they do go through multiple stages of development, but all the stages of development more or less look the same. It just gets bigger and browner as it gets older. Okay, so thank you everybody for calling in here. You've all been wonderful. I would like to thank Michigan State Science Festival, all my colleagues at the laboratory. Yeah, I'll take any questions that anybody has.
And if you're on the Zoom webinar, you can type your question into the Q&A feature. And if you're listening on our Facebook Live, you can put a question in the comment section, and we'll wait out a few minutes to see if anybody has any questions. One thing I wanted to know is if you have these parasites, is there any kind of treatment for these parasites?
Yeah, so each parasite is going to have its own different treatment. There are a whole lot of anti-parasitic drugs, and that would be up to the clinical team, your doctor or your nurse, the pharmacist. I guess the problem with parasites is generally they are more related to us than they are to bacteria and viruses. Their cells and how they're structured are very similar to ours. So unfortunately, a lot of the anti-parasite drugs are essentially poison. And they're depending on which one, they're not tolerated very well. So first of all, you'd want to try to not get a parasite, but there is treatment for most of these.
Is there a way with these intestinal diseases to know if you have a parasite versus you had food poisoning from like salmonella for your personal self, not the lab, but different?
So each intestinal infection kind of runs a different course generally. So if you eat something and you get sick like right away, that's probably a toxin. Where you eat something and boom, you're throwing up and evacuating the other end. That's probably a toxin. If it goes on maybe a little bit longer, you're probably looking at a virus. Viruses, again, maybe take a little bit longer than a toxin. Bacteria take several days for you to usually come down with symptoms of vomiting and diarrhea. So that would be something, a bacteria would be like salmonella or E. coli that we hear so much in the news causing food poisoning. Usually those take a couple days for you to get sick and then last several days beyond that. Parasites can be a little bit funny. They generally, again, these are all generalities, generally will take longer for you to show symptoms. And when you do, it's not going to be as bad as maybe norovirus or salmonella, but you'll know that you'll know that there's something not right.
Let me see if I have a question here. It looks like. What is the most common parasite you identify in the lab?
So again, in Michigan, I guess the public is lucky that we do not have a lot of parasites in Michigan. As the laboratory, it does kind of make things a little bit boring, which is good. Boring's good. The most common parasites here in Michigan were those single-celled parasites that I talked about, Giardia, Cryptosporidium. Those are probably the two most common intestinal parasites. Actually, this guy here, this is Trichomonas vaginalis, and this is actually transmitted sexually. And this is also probably one of the most common parasites in Michigan.
Well, I think on that nice note,
yeah.
I want to thank you, Jason, for being a part of the Science Festival. I really enjoyed the talk and learned there's lots of parasites out there. Hopefully, if we keep our shoes on and keep.
Oh yeah. We didn't even. we just scratched the surface of parasitology. I mean, we could have gone for hours here talking about parasites after parasites. This was just the quick overview.
Yes. And thankfully, we have on the whole pretty much clean water and sanitation. Yes. So we're pretty safe most of the time if you're careful. But we do appreciate that you shared your knowledge with us today. And for those of you listening, we still have more talks scheduled for today and all the way through April 29th. So check out sciencefestival.msu.edu for the full schedule. Thanks again, Jason.
Thank you.